Well, welcome back, everyone. My name is Charlie McCain, and I'm an HR business partner at MRA. And I'll be your moderator today for this session, creating the framework for employee-led resource group success. Couple things to note. The slide deck and the DEI session worksheet are posted in the resources section. And I really encourage you all to fill out the worksheet with your notes and takeaways from this session. And moving on to most importantly, we have with us today Christopher Pierce, who is a champion of change in DEI and corporate social responsibility. In his role as an organizational development specialist with Kohler Company, Christopher is really responsible for driving DE&I initiatives across the organization, managing Kohler's business resource groups, diversifying corporate partnerships, enhancing brand awareness through DEI storytelling, and working cross-functionally to increase DEI and business ownership. So as you can see, Christopher has a big job, and we're very, very excited to have him here with us today. So please join me in welcoming Christopher Pierce.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charlie, for the wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for participating in the DEI Summit conference today. And then even more so, thank you so much for participating in today's session with me. As Charlie said, Christopher Pierce with Kohler Company. I've been with the organization for 3 years. And in my role, I have the pleasure of leading what we define as our business resource groups. And so really excited to be able to take a little deeper dive into what our structure looks like at Kohler Company and talking about some helpful tips and tricks to really creating a framework that is sustainable for organizations, getting that commitment, that executive advocacy from leadership, and really being able to move the needle of inclusion forward through these groups. So with that being said, let's jump right in. And we'll cover some elements here: passion, structure, resources, and advocacy. And when we think about passion, that's really about the individuals that are willing to raise their hands to lead these groups, right? Being able to identify where there's areas for improvement or gaps when it comes to inclusion, and how these groups can create an innovation, sense of I would say work streams to be able to produce different events around observances. When we think about structure, that's really about providing these groups with a framework to be successful. So we'll take a little deep dive into what is one of the stronger frameworks that we see today within this work. Resources. How are we continuing to resource these groups, resource the leaders who are running them, and being sure that they're able to support organization initiatives and feel like they're really making a difference for the organization. And then advocacy. How are we supporting those through executive leadership, giving time and attention and resources, and helping to make sure that these groups are in fact a source of feedback, a sense of belonging, and creating connections within local communities that you can harness within your organization. So jumping in, we have some polls that we have integrated into today's session. So Charlie, would love if we could jump into the first poll today to talk about some of the groups that we see within your organization today. And so the groups that we have listed on your screen are Affinity, Employee Resource Group, and Business Resource Group. What I will note as these polls are coming in is these groups are, I'd say these 3 types are really what we've historically seen to be the consistent verbiage, but we also see them take new nuances throughout different organizations, such as Employee Network is another one that we've seen throughout some organizations as well. And what it really comes down to is what you're hoping that these groups are aimed to achieve. So loving the participation, looking at this poll, I'm seeing a really strong poll for employee resource groups, and then equally as strong as none currently today. And I'm sure that goes into why you've joined this session today. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions and leave you with some tangible next steps. All right. So with that, we'll take some deep dives into some of these definitions. So when we look at infinity groups, These groups really bring together individuals with shared interests or backgrounds. This could include hobbies, cultural interests, or even professional development goals. Affinity groups often work on projects or initiatives that are related to shared interests to create that sense of camaraderie and collaboration within any given organization. So, and when we look at employee resource groups, these are really designed to allow employees to support each other's personal and both professional growth. So ERGs are often able to enhance your career development goals through interpersonal connections that you're able to make throughout the enterprise that you work for, and making those connections that you might not be able to have just given in your day role before your organization. And typically these groups have focused on underrepresented minorities, such as women, people of color, LGBTQ+, and so much more that we see today. And then when we look at business resource groups, I believe that it's everything that's encompassed with employee resource groups. However, you'll find that within the business resource group side of things, there's that business objective. So in addition to those goals around and creating that sense of belonging and development for any given employee, it's also about the business objectives around diversity, equity, inclusion, and being able to use these groups as a way to influence business results and increasing even revenue for the businesses. So the other thing I'll say too is this is something that is I think consistent across all three of these groups and so much more is oftentimes these groups are typically viewed as social groups, which can really be an inhibitor to getting them started throughout your organization. So what I want to pinpoint to you today is that they are in fact not social groups, but really add true value to your organization and can really support a company's bottom line. And undoubtedly why HR leaders decide to launch them, right, to feed the need of your employee population. So with that little bit of base work, I want to take a deep dive into what a business resource group looks like here at Kohler Company. So when we look at business resource groups here, by definition, our BRGs are an extension of our DE&I strategy, supporting key business objectives and are formed around a shared set of diverse experiences and challenges. I think one thing that I would love to point out is, the B in BRG is not symbolic, right? It's strategic. And that's really about the outcomes that our groups are able to achieve to bring both value to our individual associates, which is what we call our employees at Kohler, but then as well as our businesses. So when we think about the mission of these groups, it's really to bring together individuals with similar experiences, perspectives, and challenges in order to build community among members, creating a voice for traditionally underrepresented people and enabling them to contribute to the success of Kohler. And this is really through the focus of membership development, culture and consumer insights, community outreach, and product development. I think when we look at Kohler Company as a whole, I think many of you are familiar with our wonderful kitchen and bath products, but some of you might not be familiar that we have a hospitality line of business. We have a 5-diamond resort located in Kohler, Wisconsin. And then we also have a energy line of business that is focused on both generators and then as well as batteries. So when we think about product development and using these groups as a way to harness that through innovation conversations, continuing to innovate on products that historically have been very successful for us, but identifying the new consumer base that we really haven't marketed before. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But that's a little bit of the baseline for what we define our groups here at Kohler Company. And then when we look at our groups here at Kohler Company, we have a large slew of different dimensions of diversity that are represented. So the second poll talks here on what groups would be most beneficial for your organization when you think about what that need is within creating that culture of inclusion and belonging. Where might we be able to make the most impact? I'm loving how quickly these results are coming out. It feels really good. Awesome. I'm seeing that 50 over 50% of that mental health BRG. That's a newer BRG that we're seeing within organizations today, and unique in the sense that it isn't necessarily one that is defined as a underrepresented minority, but it's such an important conversation, and perhaps could be defined as a very taboo topic to historically have talked about within corporate America, but in the ever-changing evolution of navigating through a global pandemic, mental health has never been um, more on everyone's front of mind. Race ethnicity, that to me is one that continues to be a large driver for organizations. I would say race ethnicity and as well as gender. So thank you everyone for partaking in my poll here. So looking at at our groups within Kohler Company. So we have 11 different ones today. We just launched our 11th BRG, which is PACT, which is our Parents and Caregivers Group, which is also, I would say, on a newer spectrum of BRGs. But when we think about these groups in particular, a lot of them have these elements of intersectionality. So I'll use Heads Up, that mental health BRG as an example. While we see that isn't necessarily an underrepresented community, we do see that has the ability to authentically intersect themselves into some other conversations with these groups. When we think about mental health as it relates to the veterans community through postpartum depression, or even now our parenting group, when we think about postpartum depression, and just the continuous conversation that's needed. And similarly, PACT does the same thing, right? When we think about how we support some of our other groups through conversations of parenting, whether it's through individuals who might be partaking in transracial adoption, or what does the adoption process or surrogacy process look like for the LGBTQ community? How can we continue to have authentic conversations and begin to understand where some of our critical needs from our associates are as it relates to support and benefits and different things like that. The other thing I want to call out is some of our groups have global chapters. So what we define our groups to be is global in nature, as all of our associates who have access to our SharePoint and who are kind of categorized as our network do in fact have access to our groups. We wouldn't count our groups to have necessarily a global scope until there's a group of individuals in any given region, whether that's in India or China, or even the UK, launching groups and creating experiences and partnerships for our associates in those locations, and hosting experiences that are a little bit more gracious of a time than we can normally do just within United States. So some quick history for some of these groups. I'm just going to advance all of these really quickly, but our groups launched in 2018, and the first two groups to launch were actually our Women's Network, Women at Work, and then as well as our Kohler Proud Business Resource Group. And again, these groups are really led by a passion of our associates. They're very grassroots. We really wait for our associates to come to us to really launch groups, right? What I've seen through my experience is some organizations will just launch a bunch of different groups because that's what they believe that the need is, but they're not necessarily able to make the traction that is needed because the desire that isn't really there, right? That group who is really wanting to get activated and have the tough conversations and really be boots on the ground isn't there to support it. And oftentimes, this work falls within the HR hemisphere, right? And oftentimes, we get strapped with a lot of other responsibilities, and so we're not able to necessarily make as much headway as we would like to. Since 2018, we've had a pretty aggressive track with our business resource groups, making it to our 11 that we see today. And so, going beyond 2020, we had our mental health business resource group, as well as our Black and African American group launched in 2020, which I think when we look back to 2020 was a very timely year as we entered March in 2020 into the pandemic and needing to close our business doors to our associates and creating home offices, and just the disruption that was caused in that process, and navigating throughout the summer then with the social unrest that partaked and the conversations that have transpired since then. So those groups were definitely launched at a very timely manner and when we needed them most for our organization. And since 2020 and beyond, we're continuing to see global activation launching within these groups, Women at Work in our young professional group within China. And then most recently, we're seeing some groups within our United Kingdom hemisphere as well, when we think about the dimensions of diversity and conversation topics that are really top of mind regionally. When we think about global organizations and dimensions of diversity, gender is really the largest one that tracks, right? So when we think about things outside of race, ethnicity, like mental health, LGBTQ, generational, those are becoming more at the forefront of conversations. And then we launched our Asian Resources of Color last year, and then introduced the 4Cs framework model, which we'll jump into here. And then lastly, we launched our Parents and Caregivers Business Resource Group earlier this year. So when we think about the benefits of business resource groups, when we think about that business case and making them, it's important for us to set that tone straight away with our business leaders. So we think about the benefits for employees. It's really, I won't highlight all of them, but just to call out some of them in particular, it's that sense of community, that sense of belonging, right? When we think about associates that, especially in a hybrid work environment where we're no longer 100% in the office all the time, how can we continue to harvest that sense of community for our associates who may be fully remote and never make their way into an actual on-campus, on-site environment? Cultural awareness, being able to highlight different DEI observances that happen in any given month. There's almost 300 DEI observances that happen in a typical calendar year. And so how can we authentically give wave to those observances, especially when we have business in different regions and associate populations that identify within those communities? And then also being able to influence the business, right? Not only within their day job and what they were hired for, but another avenue for them to continue to be innovative and creative. When we think about it from the business, it's the exploration of new markets. Where haven't we been before? But we would be remiss if we didn't market or didn't explore new opportunities. Being able to reimagine products, again, that continuous innovation, that's a big thing for us at Kohler Company. How do we continue to be innovative with our products and really get ahead of what the consumer needs next before they really even need it? And then development of DE&I training. A lot of our groups have supported our businesses with either trainings or playlists on our learning management system that our associates can access. Our women's group has just launched one this week as it relates to allyship for female associates. And then our LGBTQ group launched one last year focused specifically on our hospitality line of business, on how do we create a sense of belonging and inclusion for guests that walk through our doors who are part of the LGBTQ community, and how can we brand ourselves as a destination of choice for that community. So now moving on to some of the framework here. A huge part about our business resource groups, and I shared it before in a little bit of our definition, is they're an extension of our DE&I strategy, right? So it was imperative that they really align to our groups. And so prior to this year, our business resource groups focused on career development and community engagement and inclusion, but it wasn't necessarily streamlined. And so this year we were able to officially introduce what's called the 4Cs model and look at specifically across our different pillars. And so just for awareness, what it looks like at Kohler. So Kohler teams, that's really about our internal workforce on a global scale. Where do we have opportunity to increase representation when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion? Inclusive cultures, those programs that we have in place to cultivate that sense of inclusion, whether it's our business resource groups, our engagement survey, development as well, supplier diversity, about supporting minority-owned businesses and uplifting them when we think about our spend on a global scale, and then that new markets piece. How do we identify those communities or those products that we just haven't thought about before, or how do we continue to market for organizations or for communities who might be able to use the same product, but they might need two different marketing campaigns or two different sets of resources. So aligning it to the 4Cs model based off of our pillars was fairly pretty easy when we think about the direct connection that we're able to make. So the 4Cs being career, culture, community, and commerce. Where we got creative was really that commerce piece, that community piece. And that was really defined within our community work. So much of our community work within our business resource groups is about reaching out to organizations that support their dimension of diversity and helping to create volunteer experiences, or even through different local chamber of commerce our groups are activated with, to be able to not only socialize and share best practices with other network groups within different companies, but also being able to bring best practices back to our organization and what those organizations are noting as most critical for creating a sense of inclusion, being an employer of choice for any given dimension of diversity. So I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these career focuses and what we've looked at defining them as, and what we think that you too could utilize here. So looking at career, that professional development piece, that's us, our group's partnering with our talent acquisition teams when it comes to recruitment events, whether it's at our professional organizations or even our key universities for our internship and co-op program. But then as well as encouraging our members in our development programs that we have launched within our talent function for Kohler Company. We did have a business resource group that actually bloomed into a business-owned development program, and we're able to actually utilize our business resource groups as an initial talent pool to pull from to partake in these programs. And then, of course, engaging in sessions with business leaders to identify new partnership opportunities, right? When we think about organizations that are built on creating pipelines for different diverse communities within corporate America. When we look at culture, that's really, again, about fostering that sense of belonging and inclusion for any given company. So that's about enabling our DE&I strategy, so sharing our gained insights, right? So things that we learn from our engagement survey, we measure inclusion as an index for us, and how can we drive some of the work or some of the areas of opportunity from what we see in our results through our business resource group networks, and even as an initial talent pool that we can tap into as perhaps as a testing group before we launch something a little bit larger. I think one of the greatest opportunities for these groups is the education, right? These groups are really built on allyship. And so one thing that I don't think I can stress enough is that anyone in your organization should be able to join these groups, right? It's not just meant for those who are direct community members, but those who are also allies. And so how can we begin to create that sense of allyship and help to upskill those individuals? Because we can't do this work alone, right? Just like DE&I as a function can't do this work alone, these groups can't do it alone either. And then, of course, collaborating with HR and DE&I to implement what is most meaningful when we think about creating programs and procedures and policies that increase inclusion. Community, that's really about uplifting communities where our associates live and work, and that's really an extension of our corporate social responsibility structure, and where we think about supplier diversity as well. And so hosting community events, whether that's on campus or any local community where we have associates, we have hubs of associates both in Sheboygan, Manitowoc, and even Milwaukee. So we're connected with a lot of great organizations and nonprofits in those areas, and which enables our associates to get back to to in-person volunteerism, which a lot of companies, employees were hungry for. When we think about supplier diversity, so we have a wonderful supplier diversity manager that stays really close knit to our groups. And so when we think about sourcing either for swag for their events, or even just for speakers to bring into for that inclusion piece about education, new vendors that we can even then bring onto our vendor list for continuous utilization and new partnership opportunities well outside just our BRG hemisphere. And of course, engaging in local events and festivities. Our LGBTQ group is very activated in the local Milwaukee Pride Parade. So we saw a great over 70 people participated, and we had a heritage van for our celebrating 150 years this year, and in the parade, and had our families out there as well. So it was a really impactful event, and for us to continue to bring brand awareness to the community, especially being an hour away from Milwaukee. And then commerce, that's really, again, that last piece about exploring new diverse markets. So one thing I'll give you as an example for this is within our kitchen and bath space, we have a space focused on aging in place. And so those who are more elderly in their life stage. And what we found is that not only marketing or products that are being developed for this population also supports those who have physical disabilities as well. So for us not to include them in the product development and ideation stage and getting those opinions, we'd be remiss not to, right? When we think about how we can continue to reach a broader audience within our products and services, and creating ones that are authentic and meet the needs of every unique individual. So when we look at this so when we look back to the 4 C's and how does this kind of all operate together, I wanted to leave you with, give you some examples of what we've seen to be some key areas of opportunity or programs or initiatives that fall into each one of these different pillars. But before I give that to you, one thing that we've also added on to the 4 C's that's been specific to Kohler was an operations side. So we recognize that, outside of just the 4 C's element, there is, still a decent amount of work that is needed to maintain just the everyday happenings within these groups. So we want to make sure that we're also giving time and attention to that work outside of just the 4 C's and not making extra work for some of these groups, some of these leads within these pillars, so they can really focus on what's most impactful. So looking at kind of how some of these line up, again, I won't read all of these on here for you, but just to highlight a couple underneath every single one. So, career, mentoring, right? So as well as learning. So when we think about promoting internal curriculums when it comes to professional development, we have a great partnership with LinkedIn Learning. It's something that we continue to promote to our Kohler associates to upskill on any given topic as it relates to their own professional development. When we think about culture, again, those days of observance when it comes to either, we're ending, we're on the heels end now of Hispanic Heritage Month, but we're quickly going to be approaching Veterans Day, right? And so how are we able to harness our groups within creating experience and giving ways and opportunity for our associates to learn a little bit more about this day of importance to the community and how they can get involved and what their allyship could be like. Focusing on cross-BRG collaboration. And we think again about that intersectionality of mental health awareness, which happens in May. And so we see our groups do a wonderful mental health panel that takes place across all 11 of them. And they talk a little bit more about what mental health looks like within their community. Community, it's about those pipeline opportunities for those external organizations, commerce, that product marketing, product development, and of course, operations when we think about budgeting, key metrics, and when we think about what does success look like, and communication. And one thing that I didn't add to this, to operations that I think would be important too is as you think about branching out your groups, while they might first start from your home base, whatever that might be, there might be benefit in launching additional groups at other hubs or other locations. And so you could consider these people within an operation lead as another extension hub of any given group, right? So that they can then begin to operate underneath this larger umbrella so that they can gain those tools and resources to be successful until they're ready to then organically launch into a larger structure that you see before you today. So then when we think about a team structure for this, wanting to lay that out for you as well. This is the strategy that we've identified within our 4 C's model. And we've adopted as of this year, the evolution into a co-executive sponsor strategy. And this has really been beneficial to support not only the executive sponsors who have been really critical since the inception of these groups, but also to gain support from other executives that are either newer to the organization or officially ready to step up and get involved. And it's a way for us also to be very strategic with some of these appointments as well. When we think about the allyship component of it, right? So our women's group does have a male executive sponsor alongside of them to help continue to be that advocate. Same goes for our Black and African American business resource group as well, continuing to have the maybe the uncomfortable conversations that we need to start getting comfortable with having as it relates to breaking down stigmas and breaking down barriers and creating opportunity. We've identified that co-leadership between co-presidents, so migrating away from vice presidents and presidents, but really that co-leadership, as we know that in any given role, these are volunteerism roles, right? So your day job comes first. And so we recognize that your capacity ebbs and flows with your role. And so this structure gives each leader the opportunity to have a little bit of grace with what they do, right? So there might be, excuse me, there might be specific roles that they might take on as co-presidents, but at the end of the day, they're both held responsible at the same level and can make decisions equally. And then what we've also done with the 4Cs model is navigating into a two co-chair strategy. And this is really based off of organic evolution, right? So if you only start with one person underneath, that's perfectly fine, right? Two doesn't have to be the goal for anyone. It's really about what's going to meet your need and what the current situation is at your organization and what's obtainable. Right, so we're very lucky to have a lot of interest within these groups, and we haven't had too many challenges with finding appointments within each of these different pillars for these groups. But again, it's just something to keep in mind that it's not something that you need to try to rush through in order to fill. So looking at the essential members that we see within our business resource group program, we have the program manager usually housed within DE&I for our organization, but we might see this within our HR sphere as well. So this leads us to my next poll here, which is focusing on where would a program like employee resource groups sit within your organization today? All right. Awesome. All right. Let's see. I'm seeing that one for legal, which is that's not unheard of at all when we think about just the compliance and inclusion piece that we've historically seen with these groups. But typically we see this within HR, and now even more so with DE&I, as organizations are beginning to continue to launch DE&I programs outside of HR. So thank you for participating in that poll. That's very helpful to know as we continue to dive in. So when we think about these groups and the program managers in particular, I'll label out some of these areas of focus here. Really, when I look at my role in particular, it's being a resource for all of our groups, in the form of giving advice for their strategy. What's going to be most imperative for the organization? How do I connect the dots to what I'm seeing from my point of view within where the organization is at in the sense of inclusion? Being able to review budget needs and communication. So it's a great time for me to showcase to you that we do offer a budget for all of our associates. And this is something that, all of our groups, so that we can continue to harness their sense of inclusion. Typically what we see groups today have is anywhere from anywhere from $2,000 all the way up to, I've seen some organizations have budgets of $20,000. And that's really dependent on your organization. And again, what group type you have, whether that's that Infinity, employee, or business resource group, that usually goes along with what budgets are allocated and what that dollar amount is. what you're hoping these groups can achieve. But what I've been very intentional about is when there's opportunities or events that take place that really benefit the company as a whole, that's something that the business should own, right? So we shouldn't necessarily be asking them to pay for certain sponsorships out of their budget, but rather let's take that ownership and that commitment back onto the business. Coordinating intergroup synchronization, right? When we think about continuous intersectionality and partnerships that might happen, and also monitoring their activities and their contributions. So when we go back to any given, at the end of the calendar year, and when we think through how did our employee resource groups, business resource groups impact our organization, looking back at those 4Cs models and saying, here's how our groups supported or influenced community. Here's how what they did for culture or commerce, right? It just tells a stronger story, especially when we think about how it levels back up to our DE&I strategy. When we think about our executive sponsors, these individuals are huge, right? And so while it's common for these individuals to identify within the demographic, it's not required, right? Especially those who either have histories with different communities or cultures on a global scale, and those who are just willing to raise their hand. Typically a VP and above to help really harness that influence that they have throughout an organization. And one thing I really want to pinpoint is that this is a development opportunity for your senior leaders, right? And how they can continue to harness their own people leadership skills, their empathy skills as well, and being able to use their sphere of influence to truly develop their own sense of inclusion for their organization that they might support by building up not only any given group that they support, but also the broader DE&I and BRG program as a whole. So that's a great way for them to continue to upskill. And then of course, it's a great access opportunity to work with a senior leader. So coaching opportunity for those co-leads as well. When we look at our leadership team, those are really about the recruitment of the executive sponsors and executive advocates. So while we have two today, we also see these groups really operate within, operate alongside other executives who are willing to champion their work and give them time at town halls and show up for in-person events and visibly show their commitment. Represent their BRGs at those town halls or within the local community as we're building out partnerships and with different organizations, and ultimately be a resource for all of our associates. So a lot of our leadership teams, so I'll use an example within our mental health group. All of our leaders are certified mental health support specialists. And so what that means is that they have the tools and resources to successfully help someone navigate in a mental health crisis, right? So that doesn't mean that they're, that they're a therapist by any means or a doctor, but they're able to help assist in finding them the right resources, whether that's navigating them to our EAP programs or helping to make connections within their local communities, within organizations that they can reach out to for support. That's a great way that they can continue to step up for the organization and help make sure that we have the tools and the resources to be successful. And based off of those conversations, ensuring that our EAP program continues to stay diverse and competitive with what we need it to be to support our associates. And lastly, the last key number, of course, is our membership, right? When we think about their professional development, their key learnings and education, participation in both virtual and on campus and in community events, being able to contribute ideas and strategies. So through the intake surveys that these groups do for their memberships, learning about what membership wants, right? What they feel like is going to be most effective for their own learning or what they're looking to receive out of this group. And hopefully then working their way into potentially a development opportunity for joining the leadership team as well. So when we think about next steps and how to get started, it can be a very daunting conversation and how to do. So really want to break that down a little bit for you. And so how we define that within our organization is scheduling, an initial meeting within, DE&I, HR, legal, whoever that key that key sector is to get this conversation started, and establishing what that need is, right? So who are the group of people or individuals that have either, initially came to you with this conversation, or where conversation is, starting to boil up, and why this is so important, and why it's needed, and developing that key purpose for what the group is then going to solve once upon it being launched. Gauging that group interest across across your employee population on, what is their appetite to get involved, both from a membership but also a leadership standpoint, and identify who are those potential champions that you could maybe tap for an opportunity to be an advocate for you, either through past conversations that you've been a part of with them, or even just ones that through HR that you feel like this would be a great development opportunity for this leader, pending that they have a passion for that dimension of diversity, because that first and foremost is most critically needed. And then, of course, forming that charter against that 4Cs model. So what are those areas of opportunity that are going to be impacted by this business resource group? What are they hoping to obtain or to achieve to create that sense of belonging and inclusion for this community? Identifying business opportunities to secure business budget, right? So when we think about that operational plan, and you like using the LGBTQ group as an example, we know that June is Pride Month. So we know that money would need to be allocated for Pride Month, whether it's through swag, or whether it might be through T-shirts, where you can even use diverse-owned, minority-owned business to produce them, right? There's different connections that you can continue to make throughout different elements of your business resource group. And then, of course, secure that executive champion and aligning with HR and DE&I. And lastly, be an inspiration, right, to the kickoff meeting, ensuring that you're then inviting those who have gained interest to this initial kickoff meeting, and helping to not only pinpoint other opportunities to produce into the charter. So you might have an idea of what different focuses you want to highlight within the 4Cs, but then having a launch meeting, you can then even ideate those ideas from your prospective members on adding additional aspects to that you didn't necessarily think of from the get-go. One of the other things that we see as well within these groups is that I don't know if we have an interest to just launch just one group, but perhaps, but we know that we need to launch something to support all the different observances and communities that we see represented within our organization. How do we pick just one to start out with? And that leads me to a best practice that I'd like to highlight to you, which is an inclusive launch strategy. And that's really focusing on a group that supports all different dimensions of diversity, right? So a multicultural group that is harnessing race, ethnicity, gender, LGBTQ+. And it's a way for you to then develop programming, communication, showcase visibility to different observances that happen, while also then being able to harness the potential membership from your associate or employee population to then organically build into and launch into some of these groups individually, right? So then, when that membership, starts to bubble up to the top of, I think we're ready for a women's group, right? Then we can organically launch into that while still keeping the multicultural group, right? And you can then partner with them, but then they still are able to run with those other initiatives while still having that visibility and creating that sense of inclusion until they're ready to launch these other groups as well. That's just some food for thought to think about, what if that may be appetizing as you're having some of these stakeholder communication meetings and gaining that alignment with those of influence. So then my last slide for you here is focusing on a launch timeline upon you identifying what those groups, so using the multicultural group as an example. And I'll lay out all of these, and hopefully you've already downloaded the PDF of this PowerPoint. So again, I won't read off all of these for you in the interest of time, But this is really a helpful get started launch timeline for you to focus on for these groups, and being able to start from getting started to creating what that project team looks like, to identifying those key leaders, setting that date, and then what that kickoff meeting looks like. And what I will also say too is that ideally, when you're launching these groups, that you launch them around a day of importance, potentially around that dimension of diversity. It's obviously not required, but it's also always very beneficial when you think about continuing to drive the why and of the importance. So with that, that concludes my formal presentation for you all today on creating a framework for BRG success. I'm seeing some chat coming through as well. I'll gladly stop sharing my screen now, and I'll look over to Shirley if there's any questions that I can help to answer in the next few minutes here.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. We do have a few questions. You did an excellent job of giving us a full dose of information. You did give insight on how to get started, but we've had several questions from organizations that obviously are a lot smaller than Kohler. So as you think about the information you shared, is there any specific things you can give to a smaller organization about how to get started?
Yeah, how to get started. I think going back to that initial strategy slide, right, about the inclusive strategy, when you think about one that encompasses all, I think, and that's something that we've even seen happen within the global scale of our DE&I strategy teams is, while our roles within DE&I from the US are global, we also depend on our HR VPs within any given region to help us help skill up on what DE&I looks like in India or the UK. And what these councils have done is launching these multicultural groups to help pinpoint those areas of importance and helping initially get those conversations started. So for companies that don't necessarily have a DE&I program built out yet, or are still working on the business case, it's really using your employees as your area of knowledge on what they need, right? So whether that's through your people survey, if you do a climate survey or pulse survey, are there areas of opportunity that are coming through either results or comments that you can pull, and helping to align those to building your business case for launching a business resource group or employee resource group. But again, I think starting small and really gaining sure that you have those stakeholders first and foremost.
Okay, great.
Yep.
We've got time for a couple more questions, or maybe at least one. One of the other questions out there was, how do you balance autonomy versus governance? Who does the approvals for programs and events?
Yes. So that's a great question. And so these groups are very grassroots in nature, and we really want to keep that, even though we've migrated to a business mindset with them. And so what that is through the organizational plans, it's a way which we start at the end of the year, launching into the new year. We really try to get ahead of any potential planning that they're hoping to achieve for the next calendar year, for us to be able to work with them on aligning an initiative, or or finding a way to yes, perhaps, if it's something that we've attempted in the past but wasn't something that was appetizing now, but I think we should revisit the conversation. Ultimately, as an extension of DE&I, we need to be in the know of what our groups are doing, right? But we've built a culture of collaboration rather than necessarily for lack of a better word, dictatorship, when we think about you can or cannot do this, right? So it's come to us with what you're hoping to achieve, and let's work together to make it happen, right? So that the governance still happens at the DE&I sector, and that's just something that we've built along with our leaders, and building that trust.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're almost out of time. I believe you hit on most of the other questions that were in the chat, and your presentation. It was very well-rounded. Christopher has given us a lot to think about, from this 4 C's model to the different types of ERGs, BRGs, and so forth. We've talked a little bit about small organizations, how to scale it right. He gave us some great points on executive leadership and sponsorship, which I think was one of the questions in the chat also. And that sort of correlated with the question about mentorship. So Christopher, I don't think you could have shared any more or anything more in depth with us. It was awesome. And we've got that same type of feedback in the chat. I think one of the things that we want to lead with, which was very important in your presentation, is the allyship. And you don't have to be to belong. And I think that's
Yes.
something for all of us to remember.
Yes, 100%, Charlie. When in our prep meeting, when you said that with me, it's something I wrote down and something I'm going to continue to add to my vocabulary. You don't have to be to belong. So thank you so much for the time, everyone, for joining me. I know if I didn't get to your question, I'm so sorry. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll happily talk through any of our strategy or help you with any best practice that you might have. But enjoy the rest of your conference here, and continue doing great work within your organization. So thank you.
Great. Kudos to everyone. And thanks again, Christopher. And we will see you guys. We're going to be heading back on a break right now until 11:25, and then you can choose your next window in terms of your next session. So we'll see you then.